I spoke to Senator Little a short time ago. Senator, welcome to the program.
Thank you. Great to join you.
Indigenous affairs became a really contested area before the last election. The Liberal Party is, of course, going through some soul-searching after the election loss. Do you think the way the party talks about Indigenous issues should also change?
Well, I think, we did see a very divisive campaign during the failed voice to Parliament. We do need to have a look at all of the policies that we took to the election, and Susan Lee, as our Leader of the Opposition, has committed to do that. The issues that we talk about in Indigenous affairs haven't changed since the election. They're still just as important and valid. In fact, as the cost of living grows, they're becoming even more of a crisis. So I will continue, as I did previously, to raise the issues that need to be raised for Indigenous Australians, even if it makes people feel uncomfortable.
Well, let's go to one of the policies that was very much a Peter Dutton policy, and that was for a Royal Commission into child sexual abuse in Indigenous communities. Is that something that the Coalition still wants to see?
Well, I'll say again, all our policies are up for review. That's been made really clear by the Leader of the Opposition. Let me say, though, that those issues have not gone away with the change post the election. They remain the same. They remain a priority for those children and young people and victim survivors who are working through those issues. And so they will remain an important priority for me.
But of course there's different ways of dealing with issues that are happening in the communities. Is a Royal Commission really the right way to resolve some of these problems?
Well, I'll go back to all of those are up for review, but those issues of a disproportionate number of children in Aboriginal communities that have experienced sexual abuse remains. It is evidenced in so many reports over many, many years. And I want to understand and respond to why the many recommendations from those reports that have been done previously have not resulted in the change that people require.
One of the big issues, as you know, in Indigenous communities is the level of child removal. Is that something that concerns you? Do you think we need to reduce the rate of child removal from Aboriginal families?
Well, let's talk about child removal generally. There are nearly 50,000 children in Australia who are in out-of-home care. The disproportionate number are Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children. Of course that troubles me that there are so many children not able to be with their parents, and that's why I will be focused on the issues that matter in the here and now. Getting early intervention and prevention in place, getting those frontline services focused on doing better, and making the change in that terrible trajectory. That will be a focus of my term as the Shadow Minister for Indigenous Australians.
So we've heard, and I certainly spoke to people on four corners in the Liberal Party who talked about culture wars and wanting to move away from culture wars. Do you agree with that it should be on issues that matter to people rather than issues that are emblematic of disagreement and culture war issues?
So let me talk about culture, and I want to understand from people, what do they mean about culture? When you look at the child placement principle that relates to children in out-of-home care, people will raise that it's important to raise children in culture. I say, first and foremost, it is about a child's safety. Culture may be an important protective factor, but it is not at the exclusion of all other things that provide protective factors to those children. So I will continue to talk about culture and its place in solutions, and to do that, to raise those issues about culture being a protective factor but not at the exclusion of others, is not to be involved in a culture war. So those things I think are important for people to understand. They are conversations that must be had, and it is not acceptable to dismiss any conversation about those things as simply culture wars.
One thing that your predecessor in the role, Jacinta Nampijinpa-Price, said, which caused a lot of controversy, and you will recall it, was that colonisation was good for Indigenous Australians. Now, a lot of people contest that because if you see, of course, just the rates of from child removal to early death to disease. Indigenous Australians clearly have difficult life trajectories. What are your reflections on that language, that colonisation has been a positive thing for Indigenous Australians?
Well, I focus on the here and now, and what I say is when people talk to me about what they need, they don't talk about treaty, they don't talk about truth-telling, they don't talk about colonisation. They talk about wanting to get the services they need to simply lead a better life. Today, I visited Food Bank here in South Australia. They told me that 68% of people that are seeking help actually have a job. Now imagine what's happening to those people who are on some form of income support. This is Food Bank that delivers into South Australia and the Northern Territory. I want to understand how those things actually affect Indigenous Australians in the here and now, the very issues that are impacting them today.
You mentioned truth-telling and truth and treaty, those issues. Do you think a truth-telling process would be perhaps useful in Australia?
Well, I have not been able to understand myself what people mean who are pushing this idea about truth-telling. I don't even think they actually know because they haven't explained it. I go again to my focus and my attention will be on the here and now, the issues that matter most to the child that's being neglected right now, to the child who wants a better education right now, and to the child who wants to get that education so that they can get a job. Not in an employment program called Real Jobs, but a real job. That's what I want to be focused on, and that's why I will continue to be disciplined about being focused on.
The recent deaths in custody of 2 Indigenous men in the Northern Territory have, of course, as you well know, really devastated those communities, and I think other people across the country too. The Minister, Melandiri McCarthy, has called for an independent inquiry into Kumanjai White's death. Should it be independent of police?
Well, those families deserve an explanation as to what has actually happened, and of course my thoughts are with those families. In the Northern Territory, there's a statutory obligation, a legislative obligation for the police to do their work. There's also a statutory obligation on the coroner to do the work that needs to be done. And there's also an independent process that's available under the Northern Territory Ombudsman. When Northern Territory federal ministers talk about investigation, what I'd like them to investigate right now is the $30 million that went into the Northern Territory for policing in the last 12 months. What have they done already to understand how that money's been spent and how much of that money has gone into looking at police procedures and to making sure that people, when they come into contact, unfortunately, with the police, and that's not everyone, actually don't end up with a death or with further harm. When you go into protective custody, you deserve to be kept safe and well, and that's what's really important here. The government needs to look at itself and what it has done in following up on the $30 million that it gave the Northern Territory government in the last 12 months and what's been done with that money. That is why one of the policies that I'm sure will continue on is asking for an audit of those frontline services that deliver to the most vulnerable people to be done. So that's going to be really important. They are on the front line.
So you'd still want to see an audit into Indigenous frontline services? That was promised by Peter Dutton. Of course, everything's under review, but you think that's a good idea, worthy of keeping?
I've always talked about making sure that funding to the most vulnerable people is spent as it was intended, and that is all services that deliver for vulnerable people.
On another issue, which is clearly going to become a bigger story in the next couple of months, Indigenous organisations from across the country will come together in September to consider the creation of a new national body dedicated to advancing the interests of First Nations people. Do you think the formation of this body is a positive development?
Well, there are 2 issues with that statement you've just made. One is these Indigenous organisations, who mostly are funded by the Australian taxpayer, should be focused on the best service delivery for the very people they exist to serve. That should be their focus. first and foremost. Secondly, those people who are delivering those services need to make sure that they are delivering those effectively. And if this is what they are saying, what reporting is suggesting, a voice Mark II, let's go back to 60% of the Australian public said no. In South Australia, we have a legislated voice. Now, millions were spent on creating awareness to encourage people to vote in the South Australian legislated voice. There was a special sitting of Parliament on a Sunday to create even greater awareness, and yet only 6% of people who were eligible actually voted.
So you think it's a waste of time?
Well, I think we've seen in South Australia, the South Australian government cherry pick which issues it talks to the voice on. I haven't seen any big forums advertised that actually say, hey, let's tell those people in South Australia what the voice is talking to the government on and where. I'm just not sure that when you look at those statistics, that they can look, as the Minister said, to the South Australian legislated voice, for example, and see something that's going to make a huge difference.
In the last Parliament, as I said, there was a sort of lack or a breaking of bipartisanship on issues in relation to Indigenous and Torres Strait Islander people, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Would you like to move to a position where there is more bipartisanship in this area again?
Well, I'm sure there are issues that we can work on together. We all want to see, and I saw that through the entire Voice campaign. People wanted to see the lives of vulnerable Indigenous Australians improved. I think we're on a unity ticket on that, but where there is reason to disagree, we will continue to disagree. We will continue to call out, and that's, I think, really important of an opposition where we see things that are priorities of this government that should perhaps be refocused on other things.
Thank you so much for your time this afternoon, Senator Little.
Thank you.
Authorised by Karen Little, Liberal Party, Adelaide.